Yeah.
So welcome. Despite some technical difficulties, we are going to bring our lecture today anyway. No redos on this one. But I want to welcome you. I'm Elizabeth Pfau, Director of Labor at Wayne. I have the privilege today of introducing today's distinguished Fraser Center lecturer, Professor William Trotter Jr., Giant Eagle University Professor of History and Social Justice, and the founder and director of the Center for African American Urban Studies and the Economy at Carnegie Mellon University. I first met Joe at the University of Minnesota in the fall of 1979. I was an incoming doctoral student with a desk in the same graduate student office as Joe. He was working on his dissertation then on Black Milwaukee. He impressed us with his seriousness of purpose and discipline, which actually stood out in a graduate student culture centered on the 400 bar and its fabulous jukebox. Needless to say, at the end of his doctoral work, Joe, unlike many of us, was laser focused on his PhD. He graduated during spring of 1980. His discipline paid off in a career dedicated to expanding and enriching our knowledge of Black urban and labor history with his pioneering scholarship. I'd almost amend that. I think I have to amend that. Our knowledge of urban and labor history, not solely defined by race, but shape. Dr. Trotter's first book, Black Milwaukee, The Making of an Industrial Proletariat, from 1985, challenged the tendency among historians to limit Black historical experience in Milwaukee simply as an extension of the city's ghettos. And this study, lauded as a, quote, valuable and provocative book that opened up new areas for heated debate, Trotter upended earlier characterizations by decidedly treating Black workers in Milwaukee as industrial laborers. Since its initial publication, Black Milwaukee has been re-released with an updated prologue and epilogue and other auxiliary essays. Joe's next book, Coal, Class, and Color Blacks in Southern West Virginia, 1915 and 1932, from 1990, advanced the historical model of proletarianization into West Virginia and beyond. It analyzes how different groups of workers, like African Americans in the region, became industrial wage laborers. And it was only the second in a very long list of publications. In his more recent 2019 book, Workers on Arrival, Black Labor in the Making of America, Trotter again pushed back against mischaracterizations of Black workers by historians, journalists, policymakers, and others who often prefer to discuss the Black poor as consumers rather than producers and as liabilities instead of assets. Celebrated by the nation as a, quote, eloquent and essential correction to working class histories, Workers on Arrival was given the Outstanding Academic Titles Award and Choice. In his most recent book, Building the Black City, The Transformation of American Life, Trotter shows his readers, in contrast to cursory and dismissive readings of Black labor history, how African American workers built and rebuilt thriving cities for themselves, even as much of their unpaid and underpaid labor was already being leveraged to enrich business elites. By examining the Black city as the outcome of a complicated and developing process, whether Charleston, New Orleans, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Seattle, or Los Angeles, Trotter shows how workers endeavored to carve out spaces for themselves, often in the context of ongoing battles for civil and human rights. There have been many other honors and recognitions. Joe has served on many academic boards and committees, including executive councils, the Organization of American Historians, and the Society for Historical Archaeology, on programs committees for the Oral History Association and the American Historical Association, and awards committees for all four of them. I think more significantly, Joe has served as a past president of the Labor and Working Class History Association, and immediate past president of the Urban History Association. In 2019, he was elected to become a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. But before I say the last line, please note that there are flyers in the back with a QR code that will allow you to buy this book for a discount, and also with lots of quotes of praise for the book. So now, with that advertisement completed, help me welcome Joe Trotter.
I want to thank Liz for that introduction. And I want to thank all of you who are in the room for taking time out of your afternoon to be here for this presentation. As you know, we had some technical difficulties here. And so I had planned to give a slide presentation of this book talk, but I'm going to do the more traditional way after all. But first of all, I just want to say thanks to all the people who made this visit possible, including Liz Bow, James McQuaid, and also Sean O'Brien. I want to thank you guys for helping to arrange this visit. But I'm especially pleased to see people in the audience that I've worked with over the years. Rhonda Williams is in the audience. Thank you for coming, Rhonda. You and I have had a long time working on this book. This is an edited volume that I will cite during the course of my talk. But also, I just want to say how overjoyed I am to be here at Wayne State University, giving a talk at the Labor at Wayne seminar, series. So thanks a lot. We owe so much to Wayne State in the labor field. You guys have been pioneers. I started my career in many ways right here at the North American Labor History Conference. They used to meet at Wayne State, I think almost every other year or maybe every year. But anyhow, I made many trips here, and it's just a delight to be here to give this talk on my latest book, and I hope you guys will pick it up. This is the latest one, Building the Black City, the transformation of American life. So my original game plan for this evening was to talk to you. This is not a book lecture, but a book talk. But as I get older and more at that senior-most level in my field, I try to minimize the amount of time I spend at the lectern lecturing. And so today I want to actually talk to you about this book, Building the Black City. I actually have titled the book talk the same as the book, Building the Black City, the Transformation of American Life. And the more I give talks on different subjects in African-American urban history, the more I realize that there are only a few things that people can take away from these meetings. We may talk an hour, and by the way, I was astounded by the 46 schedule here. I guess I have great latitude to talk about the book, but please don't let me go over an hour. Or even over 45 minutes. I'll be happy to break it off and then we can have a conversation together. But I do have some things I want to share with you. I created this PowerPoint. That was a great outline. I thought I had a great outline, which I was going to treat as the roadmap, not only to this talk, but to the book. But there's a need to adjust my sites in the wake of not having the technology work for me. But here's what I'd like you to take away from the book first and foremost, is that This book is about trying to reorient our understanding of the Black urban experience, and especially our understanding of Black urban residents of the cities. And so, you know, we have a lot of conventional ways of thinking about the Black urban experience. But in many ways, this notion of building the Black city is designed to help us move beyond certain earlier conceptualization of the Black experience in American cities. For example, you know that there's a lot of work on the demographics of the Black migration and the demographics of the forced migration of enslaved people to the United States. And so in some ways, there's always been this kind of theme that African Americans are migrants who help to change the ethnic and racial makeup of the population. You know, like it introduces this sort of diversity of ethnic and racial experience and pushes it forward. That's an important conception. But African Americans were not just migrants who helped change the ethnic and racial composition of the nation. They were also city builders. And I want us to push that city building theme to the front of our thinking about the Black urban experience. But you know, there are some other conventional ways that we think about the Black urban experience, and I've been part of that. I think Rhonda has been part of that. A lot of us in this room have been part of that. It's that we talk about Blacks as workers. You know, that's one of the things we've had to really push hard to get into the picture, that Black people were not just migrants, they were also workers. And especially in the industrial period, they became industrial workers. But they were more than just workers who transformed the occupational structure of the United States and of American cities more generally. They were also city builders. So I want us to complement some of the earlier themes with this idea of Black people were more than just migrants who transformed ethnic diversity, more than just workers who transformed the occupational structure of the United States economy, but they were city builders. And then there's a third kind of theme that I'm stepping out on some ground that I don't normally tread too heavily. And that is, we have this notion that Black people, as urbanites, that they were creative artists who transformed the music, art, and expressive culture of the city. And we've worked hard to bring that cultural, artistic dimension into the story of Black urban life. I work much harder bringing the working conditions and patterns of Black urban life, of labor into the picture. But there are a lot of scholars who look at this creative dimension of the Black experience. But I would say that Black people were more than just creative contributors to the culture of the city. They were also city builders. And so this notion of city building is trying to get at all of the various ways that we think about the Black urban experience and what it entails. A demographic shift transformation, an occupational, economic transformation, cultural transformation. But in all of those activities, I'm trying to suggest we need to put Black people at the center as city builders. And they were not only sort of building their own city within the city, they were also impacting the larger urban landscape. They were impacting what we call the built environment of the city. So this notion of Black city buildings is designed to put Black people at a center of trying to understand the big picture, the big city, and the way it was transformed by Black people. And they transformed it in a variety of ways, but I think the ideal that they were active builders, cities, is important. So that's what this book, that's what I want you to take away. in the book. But then, I want to say a little bit about how I came to write this book. And it has come up, Liz mentioned the workers on arrival. When I wrote workers on arrival, you guys know that we were nearing the, 400 mark of 1619. And I was working hard to say, okay, it would be great if you could finish this book in time for it to come out as part of that great celebration of 400 years of African-American life in North America. We know that's a limited perspective. Black people were here in the Spanish world and all of that, but 1619 sticks, right? So I was trying to really get at that. But the main objective was to treat the Black experience as laborers in the way that they reshaped the country, through the way that their labor was exploited. We built cities across this country with African American labor. But this book, in a way, was a follow-up, because inside that book, I didn't want to slight the idea that Black people were also acting independently, crafting a life in the context of all that exploitation. But in a book, you can only do so much. And so I saw so much material on the creative side of Black experiences in the city over several centuries of time that I said, this material adds up to a kind of way in which Black people built their own city at the same time that they were helping to build predominantly white Euro-American city, which often they couldn't inhabit, right? They were building things that they couldn't occupy, parks, all kinds of public places, commercial places that they couldn't go. And so this idea of building the Black city was meant to show how Black people double tax their labor, their own labor, to build something for themselves. And so they didn't mind working overtime on the white job, and then going home and doing double duty, trying to help build churches, build fraternal orders, build their own enterprises, business activities. And so that was sort of the mission of this building, the Black city, was to bring into focus the way Black people constructed an environment that served their own needs. But when you conduct a research project like this, and by the way, this is it's a synthesis, it owes a lot to almost everybody who has written on the Black experience in the last several, decades, but also for the pioneers like W.B. Du Bois, E. Franklin Fraser, St. Clair Drake, and Horace R. Cayton, all of those earlier scholars. That book, this book and the Workers on Arrival as well, was an effort to really tap into nearly a century of African-American scholarship that had been published over the years, and to really tell a story, that really covered the long durée, not just the limited time, but the whole thing. And I know some people say that's over ambitious, but at this stage in my life, I'm feeling like I can do this at a level that I can feel comfortable with. Not going to satisfy all those people who like comprehensiveness, but I've been working with this material. So I said, I'll just try to make sense of it and write a book that really covers the whole suite. And so similar to Workers on Arrival, Building the Black City, it covers the whole terrain, chronology, from the transatlantic slave trade to the most recent deindustrialization and rise of this post-industrial era. And it tries to do it across all regions of the country. And it tries to give attention to both the similarities across these regions and the very different experiences across these regions. And so that's sort of the landscape. But there are a lot of issues that when you're writing this kind of book, you have to address. And Rhonda was in the room where we were talking out loud about the Black City when we were working on this book. And in fact, that conversation we had working on this book and trying to figure out a title for this book, the Black City didn't win. The Black City had to take a back seat because there are a lot of issues about the definition of the Black City. And so I want to talk a little bit today about how we came to grapple with that and eventually how I came to employ or define the Black City in this book. But one of the things that I do want to say as sort of these sort of introductory kind of remarks is that when you are working with this kind of subject over a long period of time and over so much geography, geographical, you have to think about a strategy, right? For how many themes can you take up in this kind of massive undertaking? And for me, there were four. And the first one was the process by which African Americans claimed space in the city. So claiming space was critical. It was almost foundational to the ideal of building the Black city. But then in looking at that dynamic, figuring out how Black people occupied the land of urban places, the next task was to talk about the process by which they built an infrastructure that served their own needs, an institutional infrastructure of churches, fraternal orders, businesses. So that was the second major thing. Then the third major thing was how did they deploy this institutional infrastructure to mobilize political movements for liberation, freedom, equality, fair play, citizenship rights, and human rights. How did they parlay that city into massive grassroots social movements to transform their lives, bring freedom, to themselves? And I make the argument, it's in the book, but it could be teased out a little bit more, is that Black people envision the city in a way that it would be inclusive and not exclusive. And so that the notion of a Black city in this book really embraces the ideal that these spaces that Blacks, build institutions in were not always exclusively Black spaces. They were intermixed with a variety of ethnic and racial groups outside the African American community. But that was the third, major item. And then cutting across all of these categories is that African Americans were building the Black city against the backdrop, against the odds, so to speak, the racial barriers, racial violence, hostility, the disfranchisement, So it was a major thing to really incorporate that dimension of challenge that it took to build a city for yourself in the context of all these constraints, especially enslavement, Jim Crow, and now this, what we can call colorblind, racial capitalist era that we're living in, today. So that's sort of the framework or the outline. But I have, in this particular talk, I wanted to spotlight Detroit because this book covers a lot of cities across all regions. And as I give talks on this book, I want to be able to connect with the locale in which I'm giving a talk. People have a burning interest in their own locale most often. So I have a few items I want to share from the Detroit experience that shows up in this book. And And then I'll just conclude by, coming back around to these things and to talk about how we need to really re-envision the Black urban experience as one in which Black people were really city builders. They were building something amazing. So let me, I'm going to say something else. I'm talking, right? We're just talking right now. But the Urban History Association met in Pittsburgh last year in 2023. And as president, I had the privilege of delivering a presidential address. And I chose to deliver the address on this book in progress and to try to really share my thoughts about this project. And I titled that talk, Building the Black City, expanding the case for reparations for descendants of African people enslaved in America. And so, I feel strongly that as historians, especially historians of the Black urban experience, we need to consciously frame our study in many ways against the backdrop of current trend, developments, processes in Black urban life. And in thinking about this book in the context of the Urban History Association meeting and trying to put that together, I became very conscious that the reparations movement had picked up steam during the early 21st century. And it was really very much a vital part of the politics of Black life. And the Urban History Association adopted the theme of reparation and the right to the city. And so we were very conscious that this was an important moment in African-American urban life. And we wanted to capture some of that. The whole program, was about other things too, but mainly about reparation. And so when I thought about this book talk, and this is the first talk that I'm giving with the book in my hand. So you guys are helping me to think about how to talk about this book in the coming weeks, coming years. I hope they don't stop talking about it for a while. But then if you fast forward from last year to November 2024, it is clear that the terrain for a viable reparative justice movement for Black people has shifted tremendously with this election. And so I'm beginning to think about the implications of this Black city, of this theme about the way Black people constructed their own city. And in many ways, back in October 2023, I was thinking, look, we need to focus on the creativity of Black people in building their own city as a complement to this extensive documentation of the exploitative side of the Black experience. The material deprivation, lost wages, lost land, property. And that was sort of the story that was beginning to gain traction, a great deal of traction. And so my feeling was that we should be able to tell that exploitative story alongside, this dynamic way in which Black people were not totally overwhelmed by all of that inequality across time under different capitalist regimes, enslavement, Jim Crow, and this recent period. And so I was thinking, I need to make a case for this process as one that we should fold in to the rationale for reparations. Now, 2024, I'm thinking about the same thing. And I'm thinking, what are the implications of this dynamic city building activities on Black people's home. And how does that stack up against, other kinds of strategies, that Black people have employed, including electoral politics? And so now we have to think that instead of simply being a compliment in a way, and I was making that point earlier back in October, that this notion of city building is critical to look back on this process and to see if there's an embedded lesson to be learned about the limits of this whole electoral system that we've encountered and that's really in our face today. But back then, African Americans were facing similar kinds of challenges. And at the same time, they were constantly building, and defying the odds to do this. And so, so I think that, I'd like for us to think a little bit together about that. I haven't quite worked it out, but I do think that terrain for what the political environment looks like for Black urbanites today has shifted from just a year ago. And so how do we go forward? First of all, getting back to that notion of the Black city, I want to revisit that for a minute. When we were working on this book, Rhonda and I and our colleagues, one of the comments that was made by historian Leslie Harris really struck me. It was a powerful comment. And I just want to share with you what she said. She said, to some extent, the ideal of a Black city is maybe misleading. And it also seems that the ideal of a Black city could potentially distort the historical record. I think this is what she's trying to get us to think about what we were engaging in when we started to employ this notion of a Black city. And then she said, historically, Blacks in America have never fully controlled the resources and power of urban space. On the contrary, Harris underscored this point. If anything, African Americans have been, quote, oligarchically controlled by white people, end of quote. So what is this notion of a Black city then? The power dynamics weakens the case, right? If you just take the power dynamics. And so that's one of the problematics that I felt, in writing this book, I would need to engage that problematic. And so I started reading a lot more interdisciplinarily, and we began to see in the literature that a number of scholars, and I wanted to point out, a number of scholars from a variety of disciplines have been wrestling with this very issue: history, sociology, architecture, and geography. And these scholars collectively have focused increasing attention on the different ways that African Americans have influenced the built environment of American cities. And the notion of a Black city itself is not entirely new, because we go back to the 1940s. St. Clair Drake and Horace R. Caden produced a book called Black Metropolis. And in that book, they actually treat the Black city in a way that underscore three major dimensions: demographic, cultural, and geographic. And we could say political and a lot of other things, but these are sort of 4 dimensions. But then when they get right down to the fundamentals of this Black city, they do some, by the way, they do some amazing work on the cultural side. They named the internal cultural transformation of Chicago as Bronxville. It was something that Black people created internally, and it really helped define their own understanding of their urban experience. But then in the end, you read the book, and all of us can read it and come to different conclusions. But I think in the end, they accented this notion of the Black city as a kind of a spatial, geographical phenomenon. And they said, and I quote, "It is a narrow tongue of land, 7 miles in length and 1.5 miles in width, where more than 300,000 Negroes are packed solidly in the heart of Midwest metropolis," end of quote. And so this whole notion of a Black segregated environment, Black separate environment, one that's defined by all kinds of white hostility, is critical to their perspective. But we have to credit them with having a broader sense that they built into the study in any case. But when you're trying to get on top of the fundamentals, then I think this was an important part of what they were trying to do. And so for me, then, I felt that for this book, I would need to offer the broadest possible definition of the Black city. And so that it could really sort of account for some creativity in the absence of real power to shape things in the way that they would have preferred to shape things, but also giving credit to all that activity, culturally, spiritually, materially, intellectually, all. I wanted to have an expansive definition. So that's the way I define, the Black city pretty broadly, but also anchoring this notion within a framework that really try to highlight the deleterious impact of capitalist development and the way capitalism is resilient. We talk about Black people being resilient, but capitalism is resilient. It transforms over and over again to sort of short circuit certain kinds of movements, certain kinds of critique of the system. And so, but I keep it kind of simple, straightforward. The enslavement regime, form of capitalist, racial capitalism, the Jim Crow regime, and now this more recent post-industrial way of thinking. And this is still unfolding, but that's the way I do it. So let me just say, building this Black city was not easy. It was hard work. And I think it was a major achievement in part because of the obstacles that African Americans had to confront to sort of put forward that achievement. And so I want to spend a little time giving you some examples from the book that I found. Some of these things were surprises to me, and I'll sort of flag some of those that I thought were surprises in a minute when I go through some of these. But one of the first things I want to say is that since this book starts with the transatlantic slave trade in a way, situating Black people in the earliest, settlement of America and the earliest enslavement of Black people. But in doing that, I wanted to make sure that we think about the relationship between the rural and the urban, because they were unfolding in tandem. And so one of the arguments I want to make is that a good deal of what we call claiming urban space, claiming urban land, was situated early in a rural environment. The quest for land and property in the city was deeply rooted in their experiences in the rural countryside. And when we look back at the analysis of rural life in early America, colonial and early America, we can see that Black people, Africans, managed to put enough pressure on these planters, these owners of people, to force them to concede parcels of land. However small, these planters started to turn over for African-American cultivation plots of land within the context of the plantation system. During the late 17th century, for example, one planter, and this is in the tobacco growing region, one planter said, and I'm quoting to some extent paraphrasing, he said, "There is no master almost who will not allow his servant a parcel of clear ground to plant some tobacco for himself on his own idle times." End of quote. And this is very, very common, across the enslavement period, where Black people gained access to those plots of land, even as enslaved people. And so my argument is that even as enslaved people gaining those parcels, they started to see those parcels as entitlements, that their own labor produced that concession, and that it was something that they owned. And so this quest for land, deeply rooted in the rural areas, intensified in the city. They carried these sentiments back and forth between the emerging cities and surrounding plantations across time. Now, most Africans, enslaved and free, gained access to their own space, especially the free ones, as renters or as workers within the households of slave owners and the households of employees of enslaved people. Okay? And so we began to see this early on. For example, and it cuts across the South, it goes north. In the urban Deep South, in 1760, the Charleston carpenter and planter, John Williams, purchased 400 acres of plantation land on the Santee River in Craven County. This is a Black man in 1760. And a decade earlier, another Black man, a free Black butcher, owned property on Charleston popular King Street. Meanwhile, in New Orleans, free people of color reported a value of property holding of $2 million in value by the onset of the Civil War. So there was a small Black property owning, community that developed before the Civil War. And by the way, artisans were at the forefront, but there were also household domestic general laborers who were also finding ways to gain access to property. And just to underscore that it was not just Southern, in the urban Northeast, as early as 1644, in New Amsterdam, New York, enslaved Africans waged and won a vigorous campaign for land and freedom against the Dutch West India Company. Many of us know that process as one in which they got, quote, half freedom. Half freedom, including access to their own land, located in New York near an area called Freshwater Pond. And then in 1825, Andrew Williams, a 25-year-old African-American bootblack, purchased 3 plots of farmland from John Whitehead, a New York City landowner. And this plot of land attracted numerous Blacks to that region, and the Seneca Village became New York City's largest and most stable early 19th century African-American community. So that's an example. Those are some examples that I think sort of play into that theme of how did Black people occupy the land? How did they claim land as a foundational process in this Black city building development. Okay. I'm going to fast forward, get out of the enslavement period and go forward into the urban later centuries. But bear with me because I want to compress a lot of history into a couple of paragraphs. Following the Civil War, in this book, I try to show that between about 1865 and 1965, that's a century. During that period, we witnessed transformation of the Black population from a predominantly rural agricultural people to a predominantly urban people. That's the Great Migration. It just transformed. And the way we talk about that migration as a phenomenon, we do talk about Black people, transforming themselves rather than being pushed to poor by some forces beyond their control. I want to narrate something, and you will see in this narration, bear with me, the number of cities that I covered in this book. And so during this great migration, Black people moved rapidly in all directions across the urban north, west, and south. And in this book, I show how they moved to the old Deep South cities of Charleston, New Orleans, and Savannah. The Upper South cities, Baltimore, Washington, and Richmond. Old established northeastern cities, New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. New South post-Mellon cities, Atlanta, Birmingham, and Durham. Booming, largely new Midwestern and Ohio Valley cities, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Cincinnati, and Pittsburgh. Notice I have 6 cities in that industrial period for a reason, right? That's where I do my work, my work, okay. So there are 6 cities, the others are 3. And then we have the West Coast cities of Los Angeles, the San Francisco Bay Area, and Seattle. All of these cities, I try to treat those in relationship to the 4 themes that we talked about. Okay. I'm trying to see how we're doing with the time. If you bear with me another couple of minutes, I'll try to get down through some of the former talk here. But I wanted to talk about this establishment of the urban infrastructure. And I wanted to talk to you about it in terms of one of those surprises that I told you I found in writing this book. So much of African-American history that has been written from below, where you deal with the history of poor and working-class people, tend to treat their contributions as sort of, less professional, less systematic, less, in many ways, noteworthy, and all of that. And so I went into this study prepared to talk about the way poor African Americans build their city through an underground economy. Building against the grain, building against the legal, prohibitions and statutes and codes and all of that. And indeed, that is part of the story too, that there was a real underground economy that was part of this Black city building process. And we have to incorporate that into this whole notion of the Black city. But what I was not prepared for was the way in which early on there were trained Black architects who were helping to craft and build some of these black churches, fraternal orders. And especially businesses, business establishments. And so there's a need to see the Black city as a bottom-up phenomenon that included, poor and working class Blacks using their meager resources to build. But there's also a way in which all of this was taking place in relationship to some very well-trained architects. And let me give you some examples. I'm fast forwarding on this. I was going to present some of this in a kind of a slide presentation, but here, bear with me. This is Durham's realtor and builder named Richard Fitzgerald. He operated a thriving brickmaking business. In 1887, the company reported orders on hand for 2 million bricks to meet the building needs of Durham Black and white residents. At the same time, during the early 1890s, the Duke family recruited the Black architect Samuel L. Lurie to build tobacco warehouses for their crawling tobacco empire. But Lurie also designed and built a variety of residential, civic, and commercial structures within the Black community. His structures included a new brick building for the St. Joseph AME Church, bricks provided by Fitzgerald, a structure that stands to this day. As historian Gene Anderson concludes, the St. Joseph Church building represents, quote, an exuberant expression in color and line of a talent that gave Durham a few prized landmarks, end of quote. Other Lurie landmarks included Michael's Drugstore, the Moorhead School, and his own imposing shingle-style house on Cleveland Street in Durham. But it wasn't limited to Durham. In Birmingham, Black architect Wallace A. Rayfield deepened the African-American impact on the city building process within and beyond the Birmingham district. He was a graduate of Howard University and the Brooklyn, New York Pratt Institute. Rayfield worked for a Washington, D.C. architecture firm and taught architecture at Tuskegee Institute before moving to Birmingham in 1907. In Birmingham, Rayfield secured contracts to design elaborate private homes for educator Arthur H. Parker, the attorney E.A. Brown, and other members of the city's Black elite. Birmingham's African-American building projects reached into Selma and other parts of the state and region, including Nashville, Tennessee, and parts of Texas. So, this, for me, I had not read about Black architects impacting the African-American building process in this way. And then it was not just limited to these cities in the Midwest. In Chicago, Walter Bailey migrated to the city in 1924 after heading Tuskegee's architecture department. He established his own firm. He was born in downstate Kewanee, Illinois, received a degree in architecture from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He rented an office in the African-American owned business, Overton Building. He soon landed a job designing the new 8-story National Knights of Pythias Temple at 3745 South State Street. Completed in 1928 and built at a cost of $800 and $59,000. The Pythian skyscraper covered a quarter of a city block. So talking about Black people impacting their own community by building, they were also impacting the city and its landscape, its built environment. Yeah, so that, and there's more. I talk about that. But what's remarkable is that they were doing it against the odds. And from the 19th century through the 20th century, early 20th century at least, they were facing violent confrontation over their entrepreneurial activities, over their church building activities. And the examples are enormous, but I will call to your attention. In August 1835, in Washington, D.C., a mob of some 500 white men and boys destroyed 2 Black schools, a church, and the restaurant of Beverly Snow, a free Black who served a predominantly white clientele. In Cincinnati in 1841, a white mob attacked the Black community, and at the end of the violence, African Americans lost an estimated $150,000 in property as a result of the violence. In Atlanta, the riot of 1906, some 10,000 white people poured into the streets of the city. They killed over 24 Black people, destroyed homes, and demolished churches, schools, and places of business. And of course, we know about the Tulsa, 1921. But there was also Chicago, East St. Louis, and other cities during the era of the Great Migration. We have to see these, this racial balance, urban racial balance. We have to see it as part of the way that Black people build their own city against the odds, against constraint, over and over. But then I'm going to say this, and then I'll sort of bring it to a close. The final point I want to make here is that Black people use this city over and over again to mobilize movements for freedom, beginning in the 19th century, even somewhat earlier. In 1822, most prominent example, the AME Church played a key role in radicalizing Charleston Black community and inspiring the Denmark Vesey revolt. Vesey was a free Black carpenter, and his enslaved countrymen, they devised a plan to capture and demolish the city of Charleston and leave the region for the independent Republic of Haiti. And they were inspired by meeting at the AME Church. They boldly challenged the city's system of slave patrols, a city guard of 100 men and another 60 state guardsmen at the citadel. And so, you know, the outcome of that is at least 35 of these men were executed almost instantly. And, you know, the revolt put down. But the important thing is that, and then the city suppressed the AME Church. But the important thing is that when we look at the record, those churches sprang right back up, and they were rebuilt, and they continued to play a role in the resistance movements of Blacks. And another way the city played a role as a political lever, of course, most dramatically, is in the fight against the American Colonization Society. They resisted that movement with a vengeance. In 1817, at Philadelphia's Mother Bethel AME Church, some 3,000 Blacks packed the main floor and balcony of the church. When James Ford, who chaired the meeting, called for a vote on the question of repatriation to Africa, the throne delivered in unison a resounding no. And this kind of resistance to repatriation persisted across a number of cities. And my argument for this early 19th century political mobilizing is that it helps to lay the foundation for what will come later in the Civil War, actually, and then the late 19th century. And I would say all the way into the 20th century, that these foundational places, issues. So I'm going to stop there and we'll have some conversation, and then I might be able to share some of the Detroit stuff if you want to hear it a little bit more. But thank you for, bearing with me for almost an hour, right? Jeez.
Gonna go ahead and let folks know that there is pizza in the back, so please enjoy that while we continue our conversation. Dr. Goddard, so much.
Okay, thank you. I'm happy to take comments as well.